Greetings and welcome to the Emotional Alignment Insight series. This video is about abuse. And not really abuse in general, but specifically abuse in relationships. And the reason for that is that if there is abuse in a relationship, it's going to affect the community around those people. And if there's abuse in parenting, well, it's going to affect the children. And that's really what this video is all about. The fact that we are kind of passing on this behavior from generation to generation. It's probably the most important subject that we talk the least about, and that needs to change. In this video, we're going to cover an array of subjects, starting out with our own proprietary definition of what abuse is. After that, we're going to look at what are the parenting dynamics that kind of cause this situation and this behavior to occur in people, both from an instigator as well as a recipient standpoint. And finally, and most importantly, we're going to look at what are the solutions. What can we do as a community to break this cycle from happening? Welcome to Design for Abuse. To define abuse, we must first determine what our basic rights are, and they are this. We all have a right to physical and psychological safety. And I'm not talking about like legal rights or constitutional rights, and I do that on purpose. That's because we need something that we can apply to really any culture and any person universally. Now, abuse then becomes the definition of when a person's wants or needs usurp the rights of someone else.
Foresight defines 6 types of abuse. 3 that are aggressive, verbal, physical, and sexual, meaning they are typically engaged in via an action, and 3 that are passive, mental, emotional, and economic, meaning that they are typically engaged in via inaction, as in withholding or obstruction. Aggressive abuse is more readily identified, so we won't give you examples, but we'll do so for passive abuse. Mental abuse includes gaslighting, and also dismissing someone's knowledge like when it opposes yours. Emotional abuse includes manipulation of someone else by withholding expected affection, or telling them that if they really loved you, they'd do this. Finally, economic abuse could include blocking someone's ability to advance themselves, or connecting distribution to doing something of which you approve.
In order to understand the origins of an abuser, we must first come to an agreement, and that is this, that behavior is learned. I'll explain why in a second, but it's really important because that enables us to empower ourselves to stop this.
Neuroscience tells us that when we are born, we have billions of brain cells, or neurons as they are known, although very few are connected. However, by age 3, they are either wired together in synapses or are discarded in a process known as pruning. This represents how what we've learned until then is captured biologically. During the same time, psychology tells us that we are in attachment from birth until around age 2.5, when we learn we have agency and can do what we want outside of what our caregivers do or direct. Both phenomena support the notion that behavior is learned, and that the 1.0 version of our mind is in place by age 3.
If we're being honest, we need to face the fact that an emotionally healthy child doesn't turn 18 and decide to be an abuser. They are taught to do that from a very early age. So how is this taught? 2 ways really. If you think about it logically, the parent says to the child that abuse is acceptable and deserved even by silence or receipt. What do I mean by that? Well, certainly if a child is abused by the parent is telling them under certain circumstances this behavior is acceptable. And in the case of like when one sibling is harming another sibling and the parent doesn't do anything about it, their tacit silence tells the child that, again, this is acceptable behavior. If you think about it, it makes an awful lot of sense. Behavior just doesn't arise out of thin air in the middle of our life. It's something we've been doing for years and years, good or bad. And it's part of the reason why it's so hard to change. In terms of bad behavior, we've either seen someone else do it and perhaps been a recipient of it, or we did it ourselves and we're allowed to do so. Because someone was silent, we did it, and we figured, well, maybe it's okay for us to do it. We get enabled by silence. In the same way that an adult who abuses was abused as a child, an adult who tolerates abuse was also abused as a child. But to understand the difference, we must look at the mindset of the abuser. When an abuser feels guilty about what they are doing, they need to let the recipient know that they deserve it, that there's something wrong with them. Further, that recipient, if they're not protected by the other parent, they don't learn to stick up for themselves, and again are told they deserve it. Finally, they're not allowed to abuse others, and that causes this, well, there's something specifically wrong with me, and I deserve the abuse.
Those who are conditioned to be abused are taught that they deserve it and are not allowed to stick up for themselves.
I need to introduce a very important notion here, and that's the difference between responsibility and blame. The reason I say that is this. When you are tolerating abuse, in effect you are enabling bad behavior. At the same time, it is never your fault. There's nothing that you can do to deserve abuse. However, you can be, as a child, conditioned to tolerate it, and that's the key difference. So please don't ever blame yourself for the abuse. However, know that you have the power to stop it. There's a well-known book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, by this author John Gray. And it talks about the kind of inherent dynamics between males and females in their relationships. And some of that overlaps with what I teach. I have this behavior model, the foresight model, that I teach to help people better understand what drives their behavior. And this ties in with our natural chemicals that determine what our behavior is. I want to be really careful as I talk about traditional roles here, and that's because sexuality has kind of become this charged conversation in our modern environment. So I'm going to say things like males tend to be like this and tend to do this, and females tend to do this and tend to be like this, but it doesn't mean that they have to be like that. In fact, in my estimation, the modern person really blends the best traits of both sexes.
The foresight says our mind engages in two and only two processes during our waking hours. Self-esteem, which is how we look at the past to determine the present, and self-confidence, which is how we plan the future to determine what action, if any, we should take.
So how does this tie together? We have the foresight model that says we have our self-esteem, which is how we look at the past. And we also have our self-confidence, which is how we plan the future. Now let's look at the male and female and their dominant hormones. With women, they have estrogen, and they tend to be the ones who look at the past. They take care of everything that's present, the children, the house, and so on. Men, they have testosterone, which means they tend to be performance and action-oriented, and they tend to take care of the future. They tend to be the breadwinners. Now again, these are the traditional roles, and there are always exceptions. However, this dynamic can be seen throughout history. And this is where it gets interesting. Men, on the other hand, tend to have self-esteem issues. They have problems with their ego. As a result, they tend to be mean and belligerent at times. They tend to be the instigators of abuse. Women, on the other hand, tend to be neurotic, and that means that they tend to be the recipients of abuse. At the same time, we have these two different types of abuse. We have passive and active. Men tend to be the instigators of active abuse, whereas women tend to be the instigators of passive abuse. Now we're going to get into a subject that might seem kind of, out of the ordinary, but it'll make sense in about a minute. And it's this: evolution. Our species, Homo sapiens, have been around for around 300,000 years. Now, in order for that to happen, something must have gone on really well. And that kind of male-female dynamic that I was talking about worked really well for tens of thousands of years. That is true. But if you look at our modern society, there seems to be a lot of problems with what's going on. And that means we have addiction, we have social ills of all kinds, like homelessness, crime is an issue, and of course our nation is now more divided than it ever has been. So the question is, what changed? What's going on? The major advancement that changed everything was agriculture. To begin with, we had a lot more time on our hands, which meant that we weren't as dependent upon each other for our survival. That also means that, our behavior isn't as answerable to each other. More importantly, we went from clans and tribes to villages and cities. And that changed the whole family dynamic. Whereas in the past, rearing children was this multi-generational extended family process, now fewer and fewer people were doing it. And that's a key difference. In a small group, if an adult is abusing a child, it is very unlikely that the other adults will allow that to happen. After all, they're dependent upon that child becoming an adult, contributing to the group, and increasing their survivability. At the same time, the rearing of that child, when it's homogenized amongst a bunch of different people, is more likely to be robust and kind of approved by a lot of them. In other words, the abusive behavior that a child might get away with today, because it's just one parent and one sibling, was very unlikely to happen years ago. The first thing we need to do is fix the language. We need to recognize that our cultural rhetoric enables abuse. A perfect example is that a whistleblower is a bad person, even though they might be exposing corruption and even really bad behavior. Similarly, if a person is lying and you tattletale on them, or you're a snitch, that's somehow bad. So you're making someone accountable, but somehow you become the bad person. And of course, if you're a person who complains about how you're being behaved, or you're sensitive and want to talk about emotions, well, you're a snowflake. Again, another derogatory term that protects people who are being aggressive and potentially abusive, and it hinders people who want to make them accountable and people who are being victimized. Number two, we need to fix parenting. In a small group, clan, tribe situation, it's only natural that children became better adults. That multi-generational extended family situation homogenized behavior. It also gave more support to the child rearing process, and honestly, it inhibited abuse. We have to figure out, how do we raise emotionally healthy children when there's only one or two parents? What are those elements? For number three, we need to fix emotions, or really let them operate as they normally do. For victims, that means removing the guilt and shame typically associated with being abused. After all, it's not their fault. And they should feel comfortable with speaking up and really talking out about it. As for abusers, well, we need to make them accountable. Behavior changes when you don't get away with it. And to a large extent, we enable this by letting them get away with it and some of this common rhetoric in our language. Lastly, we need to fix community. And we can do that in two ways. First, we can do that by adding emotional intelligence courses to our primary education. That means we can foster children who are more likely to become emotionally healthy adults. The other thing is that we should really create these kind of liaison organization between the community and the police, so that when there's a behavior problem at home, it doesn't become a law enforcement issue, rather it becomes a mental health issue. And these would be people who are trained to not only respond to these situations, but also to help the parties that are affected. We don't have a problem with homelessness. We don't have a problem with racism. We don't have a problem with addiction, suicide, or even obesity. What we do have is a really big problem with abuse. Because when there is abuse in the home, children are not going to become emotionally healthy adults. And as a result, the whole array of social ills that we have are going to occur. If we truly want to make an impact on society, we need to start looking at family from the very earliest of days. Give them the support and skills that they need so they can rear emotionally healthy adults. Thank you for watching.